So, good morning, everybody. Welcome everyone to this session on the humanitarian development nexus in conflict contexts, perspectives and provocations from experiences in the Horn of Africa. My name is Dolf de Linslo. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and I'm also involved in the basic research program that Jeremy Lind and Rachel Sabates Wheeler are leading at IDS. In today's topic session, we will be discussing over the past 2 decades, social protection programs have multiplied across the Horn of Africa. Over time, these have extended to cover a growing number of those defined as needing longer-term support rather than piecemeal humanitarian assistance. Further, more than ever, social protection programs and projects have been introduced at the geographic and political margins, including in places affected by ongoing conflict and marked by the legacies of past wars. The interaction between social protection and conflict is an emerging area of policy analysis with particular relevance to the Horn of Africa, where conflict and political instability are habitual risks and where social protection is now a well-established field of intervention, including response to climate-related shocks. Yet, the connection between these policy areas is often poorly articulated, and while frontline practitioners may be acutely aware of and responsive to conflict and political dynamics, these are much less well reflected in the frameworks that guide social protection policy and programming. So the objective of this section, which is organized by the Institute of Development Studies, is to offer a series of reflections and presentations on these topics. And we have a fantastic sort of panel of speakers here today. We have, to start with, Rachel Sabates Wheeler and Jeremy Lind from IDS. Then we'll follow by a presentation by Hassan-Alattar Satti, an expert consultant from Sudan. Then we'll have a presentation on practical models and experience of bridging the SP humanitarian aid nexus by Vincent Val Halssma of the World Food Programme of the UN, and a further presentation by Sarah Dalrymple from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. This will be wrapped up by a series of reflections by Charlotte Below from UNICEF, after which we will be coming together for some question and answers. So I would like to encourage everybody to flag in the chat group any questions you may have. We will take Q&A at the end of the session from all of you. So we first have all the 4 presentations, and then if also you can raise your hands and we can take questions that way. I'm glad I'll be supported by a colleague, Millie Shopland, from IDS to help manage the session. A key point on timekeeping. I've been requested to be fairly strict, I'm afraid, on this. All the speakers are aware of the time slots allocated. We have a slightly longer presentation of 12 minutes to start with by Rachel and Jeremy, and then subsequent presentations have been asked to complete within 8 minutes time, which is tight. I will flag for all of the speakers 2 minutes before the end of their allocated time that they need to be wrapping up. So that's all from me, and I'd like to welcome now to the floor Rachel and Jeremy.
Great, thank you. I'm just also going to ask someone while I'm presenting is admitting other people, because we're getting people joining as we talk. So Millie, if you could just open up the first slide. Jeremy and I we are both from the Institute of Development Studies, and we're going to be setting the scene this morning and pretty much talking about conflict-sensitive social protection and what that means in terms of how we work within the nexus of development, humanitarian peace, that nexus. And this work, we're kind of drawing on different aspects of our work across multiple programs we're involved with. One of them is the basic program, Better Assistance in Crises program, and that's funded by FCDO, UK Aid. And we've also been funded to do quite a lot of work by Irish Aid. And Irish Aid have been supporting the work we've been doing on conflict sensitivity in the Horn of Africa. So we'll present from both of those. So, a couple of things. Can people keep their mics on mute, if possible? And Millie, are you able to share? Otherwise, I'll do so. Because I can't see the slides. Right. If you go to the first slide, okay, that's fine. That's the second slide. Great. Okay, so what is the challenge we are facing? So essentially, we know that crises in all different forms are becoming increasingly protracted. In other words, chronic in terms of their longevity, but we still see that most aid to these settings continues to be humanitarian and somewhat reactive, right? So we see humanitarian aid going in to help in crisis situations, but crises that are recurrent and protracted over many, many years. So as social protection over the last sort of 10 years or so, we've seen social protection being increasingly used in protracted crises, but still that social protection is very much in the form of reactive, shock responsive types of social protection in terms of how can we quickly sort of expand vertically or horizontally. And our responses generally have overlooked the questions about how to sustain or introduce social protection provision, particularly in conflict affected settings. So rather than just reacting after a conflict or a big crisis, how do we actually think in advance? How do we sustain better or introduce social provision? The other thing we know is that, and we are told, is that global social policy emphasizes state-led provision, the importance of governments being the main providers of social protection within rights-based frameworks, right? That's what we know social protection is supposed to do. We're supposed to be supporting government to provide its own social provisioning for its citizens. But when we think about conflict, providing social protection in conflict, because of where the state may or may not sit in relation to the conflict, or because of the disruptions in the infrastructure, when we provide social assistance, it may actually require us to work outside or around the state, and even with the less than usual suspects, providing through non-state systems of delivery. So we have to think very much outside of the box in certain types of conflict situations. So our challenge, therefore, is how can we best provide support and strengthen social assistance in places that are affected by conflict and, of course, other shocks that often compound or aggravate or exacerbate each other. Next slide, please. So, three challenges that sound quite generic, but hopefully we're going to go into depth in the next presentations a little bit more, is how do we, particularly in conflict settings, how do we sustain the support to beneficiaries? This surely has to be our priority focus. We hear a lot about sustaining systems, which is important, but sustaining support to those people who need it when state channels are no longer an option for all sorts of reasons. How does that happen? Does humanitarian come and substitute for the state? Are there other providers? Are there hybrid ways of working? How do we sustain support? And so some of the work we've been doing has been looking in Ethiopia when the Tigray conflict happened. What happened to state support? Was humanitarian aid able to complement and mix with state support? What were other people on the ground doing? What about third-party implementers? So we really need to think about how we do this. The other big question, big priority, is how to think about the system itself. How do we make the system, social protection system, resilient to the shock, to the protracted shock or even the acute shock? Particularly when you think that program infrastructure can come under strain or damage or completely destroyed. What does it mean to make a system resilient so that we can sustain support? And then what kinds of alternative arrangements are on offer to us when the state is not an option? Who should we be looking to? What are the local providers? What are the NGO providers? What about the faith-based organizations? How do we work to ensure that support to beneficiaries is sustained over time? And I guess bigger questions that are also important within a conflict realm is how do we ensure the social protection that we're providing, or social assistance, or any humanitarian assistance is actually not exacerbating any problems, but actually contributing to wider efforts to promote peace. So in that regard, the next slide, please, Millie. You know, we can think of how do we think about what it means to be conflict sensitive within a crisis and within our programming and our approaches. Because we know that conflicts often considered in very one-dimensional terms, and that limits, and when you think about conflict in very restricted terms and thinking only as an acute shock, it limits the scope of analysis and the scope of our response. But if we think about it more of a continuum about how can we be conflict sensitive, at that bottom left-hand side, we can take a minimalist approach where we say, okay, well, we're just going to carry on with our interventions or our approaches or our programming that actually ignores the dynamics of what's going on in conflict, right? And essentially, we're just reinforcing the status quo when we do that. Or, you know, ideally, for sure, at a minimum, we would do no harm. We'd actually try and understand what our approach or interventions are doing within the context we're working in. And hopefully we'd minimize the negative impacts, or we wouldn't be exacerbating any problems that on the ground are ongoing. And then, of course, a much sort of better maximum end of the spectrum of conflict sensitivity, we'd be thinking about actually doing things that are good for minimizing conflict, for thinking about social cohesion, for thinking about how do we contribute to peace, so that our interventions are actually, you know, reinforcing positive things that are ongoing at that time, and maybe even addressing some of the conflict challenges. So I'm going to leave that there. That's sort of the big picture, the framing, and I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. And Millie, next slide, please.
And Jeremy, you have 5 minutes.
Great, thanks, Dol. So these are just some headline findings from a review of social protection programs in the Horn of Africa. We covered Sudan, Kenya, and Somalia. This is work that our colleagues Izzy Birch, Becky Carter, and Hassan, who was introduced earlier, were also involved in. And so perhaps in the discussion later, we can come back to some of this. But one of the key insights was that there was little attention to conflict within social protection programs until programming personnel were forced to consider this. And you know, usually this sort of related to a sense that conflict is obviously about politics, and that, you know, this is something that many social protection programming personnel do not feel that they have the capacities or even a role in, you know, being part of. So it was really sort of a distancing was thought to be needed. And this is in spite of the fact that many personnel actually do have a good sense of how to navigate in these settings, although it is not often recognized as being conflict sensitive as such. And that's a point we'll come back to later. Another key finding from our review of programs in this region was that many programs are not set up to function in situations of acute conflict. This, of course, was the case with the PSMP when the conflict in Tigray unfolded in 2021 and into 2022, that humanitarian assistance was essential, and even then was also highly restricted. But there was, you know, no channel through the PSMP to deliver support to either those who are registered for the program or for the wider public that was affected by the conflict. And then finally, this last point, could social protection contribute to peace building? There was no consideration of this in any of the programs that we looked at across the region. And this just underlines really the emphasis on do no harm on that end of the continuum that Rachel shared, rather than thinking more ambitiously about how social protection could contribute to more transformative outcomes relating to social cohesion and wider processes to build peace. Next slide, please.
And
So
Jeremy,
this is
there's a minute sort of to go. The time is ticking.
great. Thanks, Dolph. So I won't spend much time on this. This is just to indicate a whole raft of conflict sensitivity measures that were identified across various programs in the region. And I think the thing really to emphasize here is that in most cases, this is not these are not new things. These fall within existing practices and procedures. But really, the point is about thinking from a conflict perspective, that can bring sort of a fresh take, a fresh stock take, if you will, for agencies on what they are already doing and seeking ways to improve effectiveness. And just in the interest of time, I will sort of move on from here. So Millie, next slide, please. So just to conclude, Dolph, this will be the last slide. In our report on conflict-sensitive social protection in the Horn, we identified sort of 2 levels to think around in terms of enabling more effective delivery of social protection in response to conflict. One at a strategic level, and really, more understanding of the conflict setting that programs are operating within, and also how programs might interact with those dynamics. So one key issue here is around facilitating adaptive management. That, again, going back to an earlier point, many personnel are already navigating a huge amount of uncertainty, are having to think politically and opportunistically. So nurturing this sort of on-the-hoof thinking is quite critical. And again, it's something that is often happening, but it's not given recognition. And another point relating to getting the strategic focus right is seizing political moments of opportunity. And Hassan might speak to this more in his talk, but there was this moment in post-revolution Sudan where there was an appetite for thinking much more imaginatively around a social welfare model. And that seemed to be missed as donors came in and were promoting a social assistance model that is quite familiar within the region, but was not sort of, seen as adequate by many Sudan observers. And then finally, another level of thinking around effectiveness of social protection is around systems and tools for operations. So there's a number of points there. Again, many of these are already sitting within what agencies do. So it's really more a matter of emphasis in using the fact that conflict is happening in the environments where social protection is implemented, using that to refresh practice and to think more imaginatively around how these practices could be reformed. So I will leave it there. Thanks, Dolph, for keeping us to time.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was really fascinating. And I see there's already good sort of activity in the chat box. So we'll pick up on some of those points raised there, hopefully later in the Q&A session. For now, I'd like to ask Hassan to come and join us for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dolph. And thanks a lot to IDS and OCHA for inviting me to participate in this panel. Next, please, Millie. In Sudan, the eruption of conflict between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces has further complicated the humanitarian space and the humanitarian response to the needs of the communities affected. The worsening humanitarian condition in Sudan, accompanied by the paralysis of government-led social protection and the reduction of official aid, had made humanitarian social assistance the principal form of support for people affected by conflict or those suffering other forms of vulnerability. In a recent study by IDS, Izzy Birch, Becky Carter, and I explored the conflict sensitivity of social protection in Sudan. In doing so, We take stock of what is happening to highlight lessons or practices that might have wider application, including for the rebuilding of the state social protection system. We grasp the opportunity to share some of our findings and analysis with you, and I'm glad to say that I'm joined by my colleague Becky Carter, who is online and will be able to respond to any question or comment. Next slide, Millie, please. The current crisis comes with much severe and extensive impact on civilians across Sudan. The scale of human atrocities shaped by civilian death, injury, and sexual violence represents a new wave of disregard to international humanitarian law. On April 15, France, Germany, and the European Union co-hosted International Humanitarian Conference for Sudan. Participants discussed the humanitarian crisis in the country and mobilized funds in response. However, the monies that were raised during the conference were well below the $4.1 billion that the UN called to support the 25 million Sudanese affected by the crisis within Sudan and across its borders. From conflict sensitivity perspectives, the context of Sudan brings to the surface 5 major conflict sensitivity dilemmas. First, the short-term focus on the stability that characterized the international policy engagement in Sudan has not only ignored the long-term aspiration of the Sudanese people, but also gave a free hand to those with a vested interest in manipulating and sustaining violence for political means to do so. Second, the involvement of the Sudanese government in conflict as a major party and its role in controlling aid in the country through the Humanitarian Aid Commission opens the door for the possibility of diverting aid, particularly since no genuine reforms took place during the short transitional period. Recently, the RSF announced the cancellation of HAC, which is the Humanitarian Aid Commission work, and canceled that within the areas of its control. And it announced the establishment of the Sudanese Agency for Relief and Humanitarian Operations instead. This duality of entities responsible for controlling aid to the country raises further conflict sensitivity concerns for relief interventions. Third, the majority of sectors that relief operations are reliant upon are under the control of the parties to the conflict. These include transportation, financial services, and telecommunications, which risks feeding into conflict. It is worth mentioning that in Khartoum, many of local responders are reliant on high-cost internet provided by RSF through Starlink terminals for accessing mobile banking services. Cash withdrawal through mobile banking is also charged. Fourth, the operational environment characterized by violence, operational impediments make it very difficult to carefully analyze the context, a crucial step for ensuring conflict-sensitive response. Finally, the high levels of forceful displacement and its diverse and fragmentary nature put an enormous challenge on humanitarian operations in terms of tracking people on the move and mitigating social tensions that considerably vary according to the context. Next slide, please, Millie. Amid Sudan's complex humanitarian context, people around the country started to organize locally led responses. This is led by grassroots organizations practicing forms of autonomous collective self-help. To a large extent, this locally led response is organized independently and with limited support from the government or mainstream aid system. While many might think that the prominence of locally led response in Sudan's ongoing crisis is an outcome of the shortage of humanitarian aid, it is very important to emphasize that locally led responses in Sudan is deeply rooted in the culture of the Sudanese society, and it has always been practiced in the background of any official aid response. These include the practice of dara, where neighboring households share meals during the day at specific spots in the neighborhood, or large community support in the form of nafir that aims to reconstruct houses for families whose houses were destroyed in the event of a fire. The current crisis witnessed the development of locally led response mechanisms, focusing on supporting IDPs or people in conflict-affected areas. Our research points to the experiences of locally led responses in Eastern Sudan, where different emergency response rooms were formed to provide social protection in the form of shelter and food aid to vulnerable IDPs. It also points to the experience of grassroots feeding initiatives, which established food banks for those who were unable to flee the war. In all these cases, innovative models of resource mobilization evolved, benefiting from the social media platforms and building on already existing practices of public fundraising within relatively secure areas, as well as from the Sudanese and the diaspora. The significance of such a kind of response is that it represents a locally led response organized by the survivors of conflict. However, this is not unique to the context of Sudan, as such a survival-led response was previously organized by the people of the Nuba Mountains in response to the resumption of hostilities between the Sudanese government and Sudan People Liberation Movement North in South Kordofan back in 2011. As far as conflict sensitivity is concerned, it is important to raise some points about how it shapes locally led responses. While grassroots organizations are not well informed about conflict sensitivity as a concept, their social assistance is not conflict or peace blind. Indeed, their interventions are aligned with the conflict sensitivity in its narrow sense of do no harm approach. Humanitarian principles shapes the working models through which they endeavor to avoid bias and discrimination. Nonetheless, they are well aware of their capacity limitations, particularly those related to the participation of women in rural settings where the social norms are barriers to such a participation. Next slide, please. This is the final slide. In a complex emergency like Sudan's, donors might take precautionary measures by tightening and controlling their systems. While this could be natural, it makes every sense to grasp the opportunity and start channeling aid through these grassroots structures. Given the fact that many national civil society organizations are already cooperating with community initiatives, they can play a vital role in identifying potential local partners for international aid agencies. This is particularly important because community-based initiatives vary significantly in their capacities and working models, and national civil society are well placed to assess their capacities. Their experiences provide international agencies with opportunities to learn more about how to work with such a group. Finally, supporting the activities of grassroots organizations will not only augment the response to Sudan's dire humanitarian situation, but will reinforce locally rooted models of social assistance. As a means to enhance the role of grassroots assistance in a conflict-sensitive way, we emphasize the following recommendations to international actors. First, recognize the fundamental importance of community-led crisis response and deepen your understanding of how they function and of the concerns and priorities of those involved. Second, build on the role of trusted national NGOs as intermediaries between the international aid system and grassroots structures. Third, press local authorities for direct access and independent partnerships with grassroots bodies. Fourth and finally, bring decision-making and coordination closer to the conflict, simplify grant application processes and administrative procedures. Thank you so much, and back to you, Dolph.
Thank you so much, Hassan, for a really fascinating talk and for sticking so meticulously to time. An example to all. So next up is Vincent Val Halssma from the UN World Food Programme. Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I have some slides as well. Yeah, great. So thank you, Hassan. It's great to go after you and maybe then present the perspective from WFP as as one of the world's largest humanitarian agencies, but also very much a dual mandate agency. So thinking, how can we not just deliver humanitarian aid, but also develop systems or maintain systems? There's some very interesting experiences in Sudan that could almost be a webinar in and of itself. with regards to the creation of the Sudan Family Support Program and the Sudan Social Safety Net, Emergency Safety Net. We won't get into that today. I just wanted to maybe give some very concrete, practical examples of a few different settings and maybe two different trends we're seeing in WFP in terms of how we engage in social protection in conflict settings and in the nexus. So on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of efforts in a context of increasing humanitarian need, usually driven by conflict, but also decreasing humanitarian funds or an increasing funding gap. So one of the trends we're seeing is how can we maintain and adapt existing social protection systems with an aim of increasing our humanitarian efficiency, improving the government's capacity to adapt to current and future shocks, and to sustaining long-term investments in social protection towards the SDGs. So I'll give some examples. The ones in bold are the ones I'll talk about. And on the other hand, a second trend we're seeing is how can we, in crisis settings or conflict or post-conflict settings, establish and involve systems, national programs, to capitalize on the lessons we develop from a humanitarian programming, to look at opportunities to transfer chronic humanitarian caseloads onto national programs and budgets, and like Jeremy and Rachel talked about, to contribute to social cohesion and peace. Next slide, please. So the first experience I'll talk about is the twin track approach in the Sahel. So this is Germany funded. Many of you might have heard about it already. So there's 5 countries in the Sahel covered here, and the idea is to both deliver cash and complementary services whilst building national systems. Next slide, please. So how it works, currently about 3.6 million people are being targeted through 2 tracks, and the tracks fall under a national government coordinated structure. So there's the national mechanisms, and those are underpinned by national response plans, policies, and strategies. And the first track is government-led, right? So through the government programs, through national systems, delivering aid, strengthening those systems, the information systems, the payment systems, the M&E systems as we do that. And the second track is really where government cannot reach. And this can be compared with a humanitarian track, but really the point is to align with government and make sure that those investments are not undermining national systems. So ultimately, in cases where the government then faces a political crisis, like coup d'etats we've seen in Niger and Burkina, or the political unrest in Mali, track 2 becomes a way that you can still sustain development investments in national social protection systems, because it allows you to say carry on with a certain vision, even if engagement with government is politically difficult. Next slide, please. A second one, and this is very high level, so please take it all with, there's a lot more to unpack here, and a lot of people on this call would have a lot of experience with this. But I'll give 2 characterizations of what we've been seeing in displacement settings in the kind of the Europe, Middle East region. So with the Syrian response, the Syrian refugee response, as well as the Ukraine response, we've seen quite a lot of adaptation of national systems to incorporate or address either refugees or internally displaced populations. So the ESSN, the Emergency Social Safety Net in Turkey, was launched in 2016 with ECHO financing. WFP led the establishment of that with the Ministry of Labour, Family, Labour and Social Services and the Turkish Red Crescent, and it became, by 2020, the largest humanitarian refugee program, reaching 1.7 million refugees. And increasingly, it got linked into national social welfare systems, economic opportunity systems. So WFP transferred this to the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Turkish Red Crescent in 2020, which kept it going and then completed a transfer to the Ministry of Family, Labour and Social Services now in December. So this is an example of major refugee crisis and the adaptation of a national system with funding from a donor that was then, through several steps, transferred to government. A lot can be said about where it is now, where it's going, but this is an example of, let's say, adapting a social protection system. Maintaining and adapting in Ukraine, from the onset of the war, they were in a partnership was established with the Ministry of Social Policy. It led to a memorandum of understanding. This helped WFP do a tenfold scale up of its cash delivery in the space of 2 weeks. So I think over $500 million was delivered through this memorandum of understanding. But at the same time, WFP managed to attract humanitarian funding, so from BHA, the USA, and from FCDO, to overhaul the integrated information system of the Ministry of Social Policy. So all of these efforts have allowed WFP from the beginning to give, to sustain the work of the Ministry of Social Policy, to keep them on track with some of the initiatives they had planned anyway, like the information system overhaul, and to contribute to the Parakeet initiative, which is now about linking humanitarian assistance and social protection. But even though, so this is now in the responsibility of the governments, WFP keeps contributing to that, but then what's interesting is there's still innovations happening or top-ups happening, such as pension top-ups that are reaching over 200,000 families since last year, as well as disability top-ups reaching over 300,000 people. Next slide.
Vincent, 2 more minutes, thank you.
I have 1.5, but sure, I'll take 2. We'll go on the final slide. So this is an example in Somalia, where I would say establishing and evolving social protection systems. So here, there's been a protracted humanitarian engagement over many, many years, and there's been massive innovations on multi-purpose cash, but humanitarian funding fatigue after 20 years of humanitarian crisis kicks in. So what you've seen then is, with the emerging political settlement and the pressure for the government to take over more of its service provision to its citizens, a social protection policy framework lead ministry has been emerging in the National Development Plan, and donors have been supporting through different models. 2 very large ones are the EU SAGAL with the Somalia Cash Consortium, as well as the World Bank supported Bahnano program. That's the one that WFP has mostly been implementing and reaches 1.2 million people. So it's reached a few important milestones, right? One, it's established government Somalia leadership and initial systems like flagship programs, information architecture, payment delivery modalities, ways to do digital financial inclusion for women. Secondly, it's evolving. So it's been used for anticipatory action for a locust response quite recently. It's now looking at productive inclusion options to have links to agriculture, to build on graduation, school feeding, links to nutrition for children. And at the same time, there has been quite a lot of talk, but like Jeremy said, a lack of purposeful planning and maybe evidence being generated on how this has been strengthening the state-society social contract between the federal government of Somalia and the subnational level, the states and the communities, many of which are displaced. So, and here is sort of where I'll end. Right now, we're in the post-HIPC, the highly indebted poor country negotiation stage. So Somalia is going to be eligible for loans, for debt relief. So that's going to change the entire model of social protection delivery and financing. And now we're discussing what does that mean in a transition phase, but also how do you deal with the still evolving political economy and conflict situations. So I'm not going to do any detailed analysis of any of these examples, but I think that Sarah in the next presentation will touch on some overall points that are worth reflecting on as we try to learn from this and plan and program more intentionally to work with social protection in the nexus. Over from me.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Fascinating material here as well. Sarah is in the room. Wonderful. Sarah, the floor is yours for the next 8 minutes. And I will give you a warning around 6 minutes.
Thank you. So for those that don't know me, I'm Sarah Dalrymple. I'm the crisis lead in the social protection team at FCDO, and I oversee the delivery of the basic programme. Really nice to see so many people online. So I'm going to talk about our collective role in supporting social protection in situations of conflict, and focus specifically on FCDO's views on this as a donor and how we are working collectively with our partners on this agenda. Next slide, Millie, thanks. So to start with, I just want to take a moment to touch on the question of why it matters, why this nexus. I know lots of people don't like the word, but just to use it for ease, this collaboration between humanitarian and social protection and peace-building actors matters. What does it help us achieve? I think this is really fundamental that we take this step back to look at why. It's because it helps us to respond to the aspirations of affected communities for holistic solutions that go beyond the historical silos in the global aid architecture and this idea that you can sequence humanitarian recovery and development assistance. And people's needs and aspirations don't work like that. You know, they don't fit into neat little boxes at different periods of time. Sorry, someone could just mute, thanks. We need to be taking a layered approach. In the countries we're targeting, there's needs for short and long-term assistance all at the same time. And Jeremy touched on this, so I'm not going to get into it, but why else does it matter? It matters because it helps us to break this cycle of short-term assistance. Humanitarian needs continue to grow, funding's not keeping pace, the system's not working. The role of development actors in playing a key role in addressing the basic needs of crisis-affected populations is more important than it's ever been with the scale of crisis we're seeing globally today. I know a lot of you already know this. This is not new. You know, I guess the policy landscape, the global policy landscape has evolved over the last decade in recognition of this key role that development actors play in situations of fragility and conflict. Most, if not all, IFIs have specific strategies on how they deliver in these tricky contexts and specific financing mechanisms underpinning these, such as IDA's, World Bank IDA's Fragility, Conflict and Violence window. The OECD DAC Nexus recommendation really helped to deepen our commitments among donors on this agenda. And the SPIAC-B group on linking humanitarian assistance and social protection seeks to bring together agencies collectively on this agenda. So the policy commitments are largely there. The challenge we're really seeing at the country level is the delivery. Next slide, please, Millie. So before I kind of touch on the challenges and opportunities we see in terms of delivery, I just wanted to take a moment to think about what good delivery actually looks like when you're talking about the humanitarian, social protection and peace nexus. The starting place for all of this is a joined understanding of the challenges we're trying to face. So those involved in vulnerability and poverty assessments come together, share information to develop a kind of complete, cohesive picture of needs. And then this is the starting place for joined up planning, delivery and results. When we're talking about social protection in particular, this means where possible, where appropriate, aligning of targeting criteria, cash transfer values, registration processes, payment systems, and so on. And where alignment is not possible, and I'll come on to the challenge of this in conflict-affected contexts in a moment, then complementary planning, you know, looking at what each other's doing, division of responsibilities, where needed, targeting different geographical areas or target groups. Financing, you know, across the nexus in this space, what's it look like? Hybrid models, humanitarian actors channeling funding through national systems to respond to spikes in humanitarian needs, or pooling financing so that pooled funding mechanisms can disperse to both humanitarian and social protection actors as and when is appropriate and needed. Just to say, this all sounds very simple. It's not in conflict context. There are lots of sensitivities and challenges to some of the things I'm saying. And a lot of the cases where we've seen this are disaster contexts, climatic shock contexts, or displacement contexts in host countries. Coordination, you know, it's a lot, it sounds a lot easier than it is. So what good coordination requires is mechanisms at the country level which bring together humanitarian, social protection, peace actors in the same place to enable joint planning and delivery. There are mechanisms set up, cash working groups, and so on. But the challenge is getting development actors to the table. The other challenge is resourcing. It doesn't just happen on its own. You know, the coordinators need to be paid salaries to deliver, and institutions involved need to have the people on the ground who have the capacity to attend coordination meetings beyond their day jobs. And this is often not there. It's really hard. At the institutional level, beyond programming, it also requires that institutions have the mechanisms to support the delivery across the nexus. So staffing, the right staff in the right places at the right time, incentives for joined up working reflected in performance management. So this is in theory. You know, there are some good cases at the country level that we can learn from. But I think in general, where we see this, it's often down to the personalities involved. It's not systematized. The different actors are not speaking the same language. This is especially evident when it comes to the P across the nexus and the engagement of peace building actors. going beyond doing no harm is a real challenge. You know, I think that understanding of the need for conflict analysis to inform planning and make sure we do no harm is there. You know, Rachel talked about it earlier, but it's that moving on to support to peace building outcomes and working with peace building actors where the real challenge is. And siloed donor approaches, you know, and I say that with my hands up and say, yep, it's there. You know, there are silos within donors and financing institutions, meaning that different parts of the same organization are working on different parts of the problem. This is a challenge. Millie, next slide. So what are the real challenges of this in conflict contexts? I think it was touched on by Jeremy. I'm not going to go into detail, but in these contexts, there are real barriers in reaching the most vulnerable populations. Development financing focuses on working through government structures that are often not accessible to the most vulnerable populations within states. Humanitarian actors often have access to these communities, but they don't have the tools to support long-term development. There's a gap here. People fall through the cracks.
Sarah, 2 more minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay. And Jeremy and Rachel talked about the challenge of sustaining systems in conflict where the international partners' relationship with the government has broken down. Also, in some contexts, systems just don't exist. And this political trade-off between balancing respect for humanitarian principles and the realities of reaching people in need with long-term capacity building. Next slide, please. But there's hope and there's an opportunity, and we are working with our partners to build momentum on this agenda to break down the challenges of supporting social protection in conflict. Our recent white paper for international development deepened our focus on social protection, and we have a specific focus on how to sustain and build social protection systems in conflict. We're convening with partners a global forum later in this year to really look at this and get this on the global policy agenda. Our Better Assistance in Crises program is creating the evidence, the learning that we need to take this forward. We also committed in our white paper to launch a resilience and adaptation fund. We're working on this now. It aims to enhance the resilience of the most vulnerable populations to food insecurity shocks, but also those exacerbated specifically by climate. We are looking at ways to include social protection in this, social protection as a channel for delivery. The G20, the Global Alliance, a real opportunity to strengthen the focus of social protection, its role in food security in conflict contexts. Next slide, please. I was going to go into detail on what we're doing at the country level. I'll leave it on the slide. You know, Vincent provided the background, but we are trying to break through these challenges in conflict contexts. In Somalia, we're working with WFP and the World Bank to try to support the government's capacity and institutionalize a government-led and managed implemented shock-responsive social protection mechanism. In other contexts, we're working to make these linkages and work with our partners. For example, in South Sudan, our technical assistance to the World Bank to design a new social protection program. Next slide, please. So I'm going to finish on complete time. There's hope. Okay, we've got the political momentum with the G20, our white paper, the work going on by others, and the World Bank's agenda as well on remaining engaged and its new commitment to increasing safety net delivery to 500 million people by 2030. We can work with them on this and help influence that. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm sorry for rushing you sort of at the end, but that's the unfortunate task of being sort of the chair panel. Right, so next we have Charlotte Bilo, who will, if I pronounce it correctly. Charlotte, would you please sort of join us and sort of offer some reflections across the presentations we've heard, following which we will be moving into sort of a general Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Dolph, and good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Charlotte Bilo. I work at UNICEF in the Social Policy and Social Protection team, and I'm also the coordinator of this BHB working group on linking humanitarian assistance and social protection. I still have the background on, actually, from a webinar we organized on Monday, also within the HNPW. So yeah, great to be here with you all today, and thanks so much for the presentation so far. Really a lot of interesting conceptual frameworks, but also really, I think, key lessons from experiences on the ground. So I just wanted to share a few reflections on the topic and based on the previous presentations. So maybe two key lessons and takeaways, I think, are one, that systems building needs to be included or be in the mindset of humanitarian development and peace actors actually from the outset in any crisis context. And we know that this, of course, depends a lot on the conflict. We have different types of social protection maturity in the countries that we're looking at. But I think the example, actually, Vincent, you mentioned the twin track approach is a clear example of that, how this can be done, how social protection systems can be strengthened while also providing humanitarian assistance or going through a more, the humanitarian cash transfer approach. And I think that also actually involves or asks to think about transition strategies from the outset. So just as an example, another example that wasn't, I think, mentioned, but in Yemen, I think we're seeing that where now the HCT, the Humanitarian Cash Transfer Program, is being transitioned to the government. And I saw, actually, there were also a couple of resources shared in the chat, so great to look at that. Then related to that, and secondly, I think humanitarian programming can be a stepping stone towards strengthening national social protection systems. And again, I think the examples in Sahel also show this. I think here it's key to keep in mind and to, from the outset, start designing systems or designing humanitarian cash transfer programs that are either aligned or at least in its objectives are aligned to the government programs, or that this is not possible, at least really complement and fill in the gaps and needs. And I think maybe three thoughts on what this requires, again, based on what was also presented. I think one, of course, a really strong conflict sensitivity analysis, and thanks to Rachel and Jeremy also for presenting the more conceptual thinking about that. I thought that was great. And I think this also requires really, and actually that would be always the second point, strengthening capacities in-house within all our organizations in terms of conflict sensitivity, but also engaging with different actors, such as peace specialists, for example, that we might not have been collaborating that much, at least from the HD side. And then I think Hassan very clearly showed the importance of local actors and the importance to engage with local actors, but also to understand them, understand their barriers, strengthen their capacities where possible. I think that's, that has been really key, as we saw in Sudan and many other places. And then just finally, thanks, Sarah, for mentioning the importance of coordination and coordination mechanisms. This, of course, is key, that we bring together all these different stakeholders, and they are already for as Sarah also mentioned, but these need to be equipped and resourced. I just wanted to share, and I'll share the link in the chat also, from this BHB working group. We've been working on a set of common principles to linking humanitarian assistance and social protection. And I think they touch a lot on several topics that were mentioned. There's one principle very specifically about linking humanitarian assistance and social protection in fragile conflict context. So I also invite everyone to have a look at that.
Hi,
and then just the last, just wanted to share that from UNICEF's side, we're also soon launching actually a synthesis note on UNICEF's learning in terms of in terms of sustaining social protection in conflict and fragile context. So yeah, keep an eye on that also. Thanks again. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. You really sort of did a great job sort of in bringing out some of the core themes that were emerging across the four sort of presentations. I think a notable comment was that coordination is really important, but it needs to be resourced. We cannot take that for granted. So I have been trying to keep an eye on sort of the chat as well. There's been a lively discussion. Lots of resources have been shared in commentary on those, with a couple of questions coming up as well. We are now starting with the Q&A session. We've got about sort of 35 minutes left, so lots of time for discussion. And I would really like to ask people to raise their hands. If not, I will pick up on some of the questions that were already raised in the chat function. So perhaps to get us going, I see a question. Well, I think one of the questions that struck me in particular from the chat was how do humanitarian and assistance social protection functions and programs engage with actors that might be controlling territory or space, or indeed programs of support indirectly. Several examples were given. People mentioned the collapse of banking systems in Afghanistan, and there was a comment made about de facto authorities in Burkina Faso, for instance, not being in support of cash assistance programs. So a question perhaps to everyone would be what kind of, is there one thing that may be done in the absence or partial absence of states-based social protection mechanisms to better engage with communities, and indeed with community-led support mechanisms in a context where access might be constrained by such actors or mediated by such actors? Otherwise, again, a request to put questions in the chat or raise your hands. Thank you.
Anyone like to start? Maybe I shall just look at the one around the dealing with governments that might be party to conflict themselves, right? I think that's a big one for humanitarian actors. As most people here in this call know, humanitarian assistance is guided by humanitarian principles, and those require that we deliver our aid in an impartial and a neutral manner, that we really meet the acute needs of the most vulnerable. We don't leave people behind. And that has really practical implications, right? On the one hand, a humanitarian agency needs to go to a non-government controlled area, have its people be safe as they deliver aid. But on the other hand, they might be working with an authority that is not deemed legitimate in that area, or that is being contested, because there's also the need for governments to be the primary duty bearers with national resources, with IFI support for the needs of its citizens, right? So I don't see them as necessarily being impossible to do at the same time, but it requires very careful conflict sensitivity analysis, very careful managing the principles of neutrality and impartiality vis-a-vis the relationship with government, and abiding with international red lines. So in practice, in some countries where there is the ability to work with government should lead and does lead its social protection agenda. And that offers a very clear entry point for different agencies, organizations, civil society to talk to government and say, well, how can we contribute? When that legitimacy gets put into question, it can either be a hard red line, like we might be seeing in Afghanistan or Myanmar, where as donors you are forbidden to fund anything with government, or it might be a bit of a tricky one where certain actors don't mind working with government, others do. And then these aid organizations need to navigate multiple donors, often investing in social protection. And Sudan is an example, right? So with the coups that took place with this revolution, there was a move to take the Star Trust Fund that was both World Bank and donor supported. WFP set up the Sudan Family Support Program. And part of that funding, which is IFI funding, still supported before the war in April last year, the establishment, the future establishment of stronger national safety nets. But other donors said none of this money can flow at all to government, right? So it's tricky. Now, in cases where government cannot lead, it's up to organizations to lead themselves. And there's a gap in current thinking about who coordinates when government cannot. In theory, it would be the UN resident coordinator or humanitarian coordinator, but in practice, it's often case by case and depends on the people that are in the room. I'll stop there.
I'll come in, Dolph, just because, I mean, not because I have a lot to offer by way of these very difficult questions. You know, particularly someone with us and where can, you know, what do you do in places you can't deliver cash for some reason or another? I guess we go to the basic humanitarian functions of, you know, emergency food, whatever. I mean, there's always, we don't have to harmonize and coordinate everything if we're in such a desperate situation. There's always going to be a function for humanitarian support. But I wonder also, we've got people here in the room who have a load of experience. And, you know, Mike, I don't know if you want to come off mute and share a little bit, because you've been working quite a lot on localization agendas, and others who have been commenting. Perhaps you just want to share some experience for us. That would be fantastic. Mike, would that be all right? Or have I just totally picked on you and you're feeling annoyed now?
No, you're fine. Thanks, Rachel. So just my context is Myanmar, so which is one of the, as Vincent said, perhaps one of the more sort of hardcore areas in terms of thinking about political engagement. And I think one of the things we've been working on is seeing particularly how in the conflict areas where there's territorial control by multiple actors, it's not just that you can't deliver through government systems. The delivery through government systems would be rejected by many of the people who supposedly would want assistance. It would be seen to be maintaining a system which is linked with their own oppression. And likewise, you have emergent local governance. And I think the thing that I'm particularly interested in is this sort of also, if I am allowed to use the word nexus in a slightly different way, that the overlapping of the development of social protection systems at a very grassroots level and the emergent local governance, I think is an area of, I think it was Jeremy perhaps who talked about seizing a political opportunity. It's a very small one, but as smaller local actors who have a territorial control of a certain area, perhaps with an ethnic affiliation, perhaps with just a territorial presence. Any means which can help strengthen a civic space, so promoting accountable, inclusive processes and social protection is a great way of doing that. The lines between that and better forms of local governance and the lines between that and the kind of core bits and bobs which are then needed to build something better, I think are quite there, quite strong. So I think that's something that we're sort of really in early stages here in Myanmar, but I'm often putting the question to donors and saying, look, let's be more explicit about this, and particularly looking at groups where the forms of local governance we don't like the look of, quite frankly. But nonetheless, by engaging in certain ways, we may be able to promote something different. And I think it's a good thing to think about the political dynamics of these things that we do when everything is broken up and shifting. Thanks, Rachel, for just flagging that. Hope that's a little bit helpful.
That's a
That's
really interesting contribution again. I just wanted to follow up, sort of, do you reckon sort of there are particular groups who might be better placed sort of to engage with these emergent sort of spaces of governance, who might be more nimble, perhaps sort of, and how could they be better supported perhaps by the larger funding sort of actors in these spaces?
Yeah, I think it's probably the challenge is that sort of middle facilitative role. And I don't think there are many groups that are singularly well placed to be doing that. I think it needs also an intentional commitment to say, yes, we're going to put into this. And so, for example, you have certain areas which are now under the governance and control and emergent local governance of particular ethnic militia groups, whose broader political economy is, not particularly pleasant. But I think those are nonetheless the spaces where this kind of engagement might be useful. It's politically risky, and I think that's where particularly some of the larger UN agencies, I think, are standing back from this at the moment. But it's one of those spaces, and I think to seize those moments does entail risk. And I think, you know, I'm hoping that somebody somewhere will take that.
Can I add a quick one on Myanmar? Because I think one of the interesting things that's developing there, you know, it is incredibly difficult, precisely like Mike said, where the agencies that are dependent on donors that have established red lines to provide aid, you know, they can't go and risk those donations to then be seen as working with the government. But what you have been seeing there is Myanmar had quite a robust emerging national social protection system. You had 7 flagship programs. There was a good maternity and child benefit. There was a good disability grant emerging, nationally funded. So one of the things that some of these aid agencies are doing is in between them saying, how can we sustain what was happening in the national systems? And when we deliver our aid to mothers and children or to people with disabilities, how can we do it in a way that we can not entirely undermine what the government was or should be doing, or generate lessons that if there is a future engagement with government possible, we can actually transfer some of those lessons, right? So we're not using proprietary technology, or we're actually doing lessons learned, and we're actually setting a vision. Super difficult to do precisely because it's so sensitive, but it is happening in the background.
I think I support a lot the idea that conflict sensitivity should be politically informed. And sometimes when we discuss the issues of legitimacy, the issues of access to affected people, we tend to think of the specific context, specific country context. I think what the major challenge is that in most of the cases, we are not able to hold those accountable for their disregard to international humanitarian law, accountable for what they are doing, preventing access to aid or diverting it. And the reason for that is that the very institutions that should be doing this is the international system institutions. But within those international system institutions, there are a lot of diverging interests. There are a lot of perspectives on what the ideal scenarios. Within that international system and the regional system, there are specific parties supporting specific national parties within the specific conflict context. So without being able to hold those responsible for diverting aid or preventing it accountable, or those who support them, which is a huge challenge because of the international system that is unfolding now, and because of the diverging interests within regional and international systems, it is very difficult to do that. And then the other issue is that often we tend to lean towards working with local people, with grassroots initiatives when we don't have access. But when the opportunities to come for real democratic change or for real local governance, the international system totally ignores local structures and try to promote models from outside with total disregard to aspirations of the people. So I think we need to mobilize that thinking about politically informed conflict sensitivity, and to be honest with with actors at the international and regional system, and telling the truth that we need to learn from past experiences where we failed, where the international system failed to support local governance or proper transition to locally led social protection and development. Sorry.
I think that's a really nice sort of comment, sort of Hassan, sort of that sort of segues into a question indeed sort of raised by Khadija Saidi, who's asking for specific, besides sort of examples of success, what examples of failure around sort of social protection interventions should we all be learning from? I mean, you've given some examples here, sort of, or broad sort of comments on sort of failures to engage with local sort of government structures, for instance. But the question, I suppose, is for the wider panel, sort of, can we think of other important sort of failures that we should be learning from?
I don't think anyone wants to come off mute for this one. I could try and pick on someone. I can't think off the top of my head. I mean, failures, I mean, think about the Tigray conflict. In Tigray, I don't know if it's a failure, but obviously the PSMP was unable to function. Is that a failure? I don't know. I guess the failure was the fact that we didn't have a system in place by what would substitute for that in the event that it was unable to function. So I think it comes back to this whole coordination agenda and saying, sort of anticipating how you're going to react and what is the best mix of providers and assistants, and setting them up, whether it's through local systems in that context. So of course, I guess WFP and others. I mean, I was talking to colleagues in UNICEF post that conflict and how people were just driving in with suitcases full of cash. That was kind of what happened. That was how it functioned. But yeah, so that's not a great system, but whenever people could have opportunities to go in or organizations could go in very specific sort of time zones. But yeah, that's not great. But I'm just putting it out there as a way for people to start thinking. Maybe somebody's thought of a better example they can share.
I'd love to come in if that's possible. It's
yes.
not like failure on a grand scale, but I'd love to take the opportunity to pick up on some of the learning that came out through our Sudan research, which picks up on some of the barriers and challenges within the aid system, perhaps on a really practical level, but you can see it as the outcome of lack of consistent, sustained and substantial investment in local actors. And as we put it in our report, localization is not sufficient to ensure conflict sensitivity, but a conflict sensitive approach to localization will reinforce the capacities of those best placed to mitigate the impact of the conflict in the longer term. So we're thinking about when the violence broke out in Sudan, we can see that the lack of investment in financial capacities of national actors meant that they, unlike international actors, were much less well placed to be able to react, to cover the relocation of staff on a really practical level, to make duty of care payments, to replace lost equipment, to keep operating. And that takes investment in their core operations over time. And then another one, just to also add to that, is we've been talking a lot about the importance of aid coordination. And one striking finding through Sudan was, so you have the need to pivot the aid coordination when violence breaks out. Really hard to do. People are being evacuated, international actors are being evacuated, limited aid coordination. But the striking finding was that there are very few Sudanese people or organizations actually participating in that coordination over time. So yeah, so not failures on a grand scale, but some really practical things, and talking about funds and yeah, investing in local actors over the longer term.
I could add some. Oh, go ahead, Sarah, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna come in on this. I mean, again, it's not failure, but I think when you look at the situation in Ethiopia now with the rising needs at the same time as the fiscal space being squeezed and inflation rising, is that a holistic approach is really key. Like looking at the macroeconomic situation and the role of international actors in supporting the government of Ethiopia with fiscal constraints at the same time. They have huge impacts on the transfer values and how many people are reached and so on. So I think it's really important to look at the macro level as well as the as the specific delivery of program level. And then in Ukraine, I mean, is it a failure? I wouldn't call it a failure, but from the learning that's come out, the humanitarian response, did it actually, I'm saying my bandwidth's really low, I hope you can hear me. Was the national social protection system considered early enough in the scale up of humanitarian response. I'm not sure, actually, and there's some people online, but I feel like it needed to come in sooner. And that, you know, now there's a lot of collaboration, but right in the beginning, we talk about humanitarian actors having that knowledge of what systems already exist and how they can work through them. And a lot of feedback that was too slow. But if anyone has any thoughts on Ukraine, do come in. And then just on the localization piece, I just wanted to set out that within FCDO, we recognize this, and there is a lot of ambition to strengthen our support through local actors, local NGOs. We're developing a localization strategy at the moment, so do input when the consultation comes out. We're also very interested in this third-party delivery through when it's not possible to work through the government. You know, the World Bank scaling up their remaining engaged agenda, working through UNICEF and WFP, which, you know, is great, and the flexibility that we're seeing there is really positive. But I think we would like to know what role there is for local actors there, and ways in which key UN agencies can be working through local partners more than they already are, or how can the World Bank be direct funding to local actors? It's a question that we are battling with at the moment. So any thoughts on that? Welcome. Thanks.
Maybe I'll just add some thoughts. So I think I would like to say this is incredibly difficult, right? And it's both the human dimension of people affected by conflict and displacement, as well as what it means to aid operations in those settings, right? A long-term development agenda goes out the window. Everyone who was working for decades on a sector, you know, it's gone, or the systems are collapsing. People die, right? Like aid actors in Sudan died at the beginning of the conflict, as well as many of the people. So it affects your ability to plan, to program. It becomes this very chaotic scene where it's hard to say, what is the long-term goal? We're in emergency response mode. How do you do it? So it's about, I think, the narrative of social protection is important, even in conflict settings. That's something we're learning. On average, a humanitarian intervention is 9 years. That means when you go into humanitarian intervention, you shouldn't say, what can we do in the next 6 months? You should also think, what can we do in the next 9 years, right? So it's about changing the way you're thinking. And if you think about failures, right, there's different actors. So we talked about Tigray. The World Bank did step in, right? The World Bank provided 65 million to support Tigray response with the PSNP, and a capacity gap assessment was done, and aid was delivered in a different format. And we just did a social cohesion impact assessment of that aid in Tigray, which has a very, very light touch, but kind of said, okay, well, people felt that it was things were roughly kept going despite the crisis. But, you know, it was a failure where do IFIs and multilateral donors and government actors, when it comes to the social protection agenda, how do they meet and how do they make sure that they are aligning and that resources are being fed into a common vision, right? And that's, I think, a challenge you see in multiple countries. Another is Ukraine, for example. I think assessments were done, and from even before Russia invaded, humanitarians were asking, how can we tap into the mature social protection system? But what happened is the pillarization of humanitarian aid coordination and development coordination precluded from lessons from a humanitarian cash sub-working group on conflicts and on social protection to be easily transferred into then a donor, a development donor or government-led. So there was a failure in transfer of coordination mechanism from a humanitarian space to a development space. And that also is with regards to financing. Humanitarian financing can't take lessons, can't think about the future in a way development actors can. So there is a gap where we need to talk about the failings in transferring of lessons and resources and coordination structures from the humanitarian to the long-term space. And really one of the areas that's critical is in digital infrastructure, right? So humanitarian actors will often use massive databases, massive payment systems that, if they're not from the beginning contemplated about how they can benefit a national infrastructure for social assistance or adaptive or shock responsive social protection delivery, those investments will be lost because millions will be invested in creating an information system that is then proprietary or blocked by legal rules to be transferable. So that is, again, a lesson. Wouldn't call it a failure per se. Localization maybe is still the biggest lesson, but we still need to learn. How do we meaningfully engage subnational actors in unpacking a problem that in the original thinking of what social protection is a national service, a national set of policy and program interventions. But in conflict settings, the subnational takes precedence because the national is contested. So that, I think, is really an area we need to unpack. And the only way we're going to do that is by trying it out, by having donors say, you know, we will give you some extra resources to make sure that that lesson is being captured, that things are being tested, without saying, well, you know, you want to do some local capacity building. How many less people do you want to feed, right, in exchange for that, right? Those are the kind of dichotomies that the current aid financing architecture presents to us, and I think we're working on that with a lot of the people on this call. Over.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for these comments. I mean, I'm aware that Thomas Burns has been waiting for a while sort of to come in, responding to Sarah's questions regarding the Ukraine. So Thomas, here you go. This is your opportunity.
Thank you all everyone very much. Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Burns, independent consultant. But at the beginning of the Ukraine response, I was working with UNICEF. And actually, like in the answer of how, I would actually say Ukraine was an example of success in those early days, not a failure. You know, day 3, as Kyiv was still under attack, we were in direct conversations with the Ministry of Social Policy. And, you know, really the key issue we had initially was on the government side of, which is we can't, due to martial law, due to the situation, change the law related to data protection. We can't share data from our our beneficiary registries to you. But within 2 weeks to 3 weeks, they made modifications to their IDP assistance program, because that was a shock responsive program. It was being rolled out, and that gave it consent during the registration to share the data to UN agencies and the Red Cross. And over 90% of humanitarian cash that was done in the first 3 months of the Ukraine response by UN agencies was done using that IDP registry. You know, the lists were going to be people, the government was registering people, and then the cash was being paid often within 72 hours by WFP, UNHCR, and UNICEF. So again, that was a key issue, but it did also highlight over limitations in that as the response shifted from a rapid IDP response to a protracted response, the existing government registries were not really particularly useful. You know, we hope we didn't have, their registries weren't a social registry. They had a very limited basic registry for poverty-focused cash of 300,000 households, which WFP and other agencies did use to target and reach, but the overwhelming majority of people who needed humanitarian assistance were not people who were in the government registries. And so that became less useful. And again, you know, there were elements to try and resolve those data issues, but the underlying structural problems were still there. But the reason we were able to move so quickly is because of the work that had been going on with the government to build those relationships, and partly because the conflict didn't start in February 2022, but UNICEF had been, and other agencies had been on the ground for many years beforehand, building those relationships and identifying these potential solutions. So again, there is one particular use case, but it is actually an example of, it may be forgotten, but the majority of that initial cash was done via government targeting, which was piggybacking on the registration mechanism of a shock responsive system. Over.
It's really great to hear sort of Thomas sort of to offer sort of both pictures at the same time, sort of success and sort of limitations. I wonder whether Sarah, you or perhaps Vincent wanted to respond to Thomas's sort of comment in any particular way. If not, sort of, I'm just aware we got 5 minutes left, and sort of maybe a question for Rachel and Jeremy to consider already. Can sort of slides be shared? We've had multiple people requesting this. But Sarah or Vincent, sort of any further sort of responses perhaps to Thomas's?
Not really, just thanks for your inputs. I've kind of heard both perspectives, and I guess the challenge was the challenge around not failure, but the challenge faced was more in the displacement context, I suppose, more in the Western Ukraine part, where the government systems, could be used, and you've just explained how they were, and I think that's really positive. But obviously, in the conflict-affected government, non-government held areas, it's a completely different situation. Where the data held by the government, needs to be held sensitively, and it's a completely different context over there. But I think the challenge made in previous learning sessions I've been in was towards the displacement context, where that was easier to do. But no, thanks for that, really helpful.
And it's worth highlighting another massive risk, like as we're doing the work with the government in the data systems and trying to support the Ministry of Social Policy to overhaul the unified information system, one of the major risks was cyber warfare, for example, right? Hacking was a huge concern in the current operations of the war. So how do you factor those risks in? And, we talked about it, but there's not really a clear model for really understanding what are the conflict risks of engaging humanitarian assistance and social protection. What if humanitarians rely on the national data system, flawed as it might be, it gets hacked, and now the humanitarians can't deliver aid anymore, right? Or what if you get seen as an independent UN agency as supporting one side of the conflict versus a sitting member of the UN Security Council? So there's all sorts of considerations, and often they need to be made at a case-by-case basis, but there's no real guideline or framework for how to do conflict sensitivity.
So yeah, thanks. Sorry, did someone want to come in? Hassan?
Thank you.
No. So thanks everyone for participating. It's been I've been trying to follow the chat. It's been kind of crazy, like busy, which is great. So it means I'm going to have to process it all later or paste and copy it somewhere. In terms of sharing the slides, I'm sure we can, but I'm not sure about the mechanism to do so. I'd have to ask all the presenters. But Millie, I assume we have everyone's email because you have signed up for this. If that is the case, then whoever's willing to share their PowerPoints, we will share them. So just great. Thank you. Thanks all so much. This is a very live, ongoing agenda with a lot of resources to absorb. Hassan or Jeremy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I will leave it to Jeremy. I talked a lot.
Just to share my thanks as well. It's been such a exciting discussion, really, just to see how many contributions there are. I just wanted to highlight one thing that stuck out to me was in your presentation, Hassan, when you said there was a need to bring decision making and coordination closer to the conflict. And that's so well put. I think a lot of the discussion we've had today has really brought that point home, that there's a desperate need for that, and it would be great to reflect on how all of us can do that in ways that are meaningful towards improving the lives of conflict affected populations. But yeah, just to finish with my thanks for all the contributions today.
Thank you too. I think that sort of did a wonderful sort of that was a wonderful last contribution. So we are running pretty much close to the clock now, and a big thanks to the panelists, please, from everyone. And thank you very much for being with us today. It was a wonderful session, and good luck for the next one.
And thanks to all for facilitating.
Yeah,
really
thanks.
appreciate it.
Thanks all. Thanks, Dolph.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.